Okay, well, let's dig down now and just be sure about what we mean by this term sonata form. Okay, now sonata form has three sections. We've already alluded to that: an exposition, a development, and a recapitulation. Now, there's a kind of implication in those titles, isn't there? Exposition, it's about exposing the musical themes. The development section is going to develop those ideas. The recapitulation is going to recapitulate on the original ideas. It's going to revisit them. So that's how it works. So we've got these three sections. Let's just think a little bit more in detail about how they work. So our first section is the exposition. Okay, now in the exposition, we have the possible inclusion of an introduction. Now, this is optional. You'll notice when you look at some sonata form structures, sometimes they have an introduction before they get into a main theme. Sometimes they'll hit the first theme straight away. So it's an option for you to think about. So if you're composing something in sonata form, well, do you need some kind of introduction to take you to the first main idea, or do you just want to hit the listener straight away with the first idea? Optional introduction. The next thing we're going to have is our first theme, which is known as the first subject. Now, we have to be a little bit careful with this term subject. If you're looking at or writing a fugue, for example, we talk about a fugue subject. Well, if you like, in a fugue, a subject is the main tune that keeps coming back in different keys as you go on. So it's not totally unrelated, but in a fugue, it means something very specific. It's the main idea that drives the whole fugue. In sonata form, the first subject is merely the first main theme, or the first main tune, if you like. And in classical terms, we expect it to be in the tonic key. Okay, so there's your first subject. Now, it's possible that you'll have a first subject group. So let's just make a note of that. What do I mean by that? Well, if you just have a first subject, you've got your main tune in the home key, and then we progress on to the next step of the structure. If you have a first subject group, this is where you've got something slightly more complicated, maybe something more extended going on, where you have more than one theme in the tonic key. So you might have first subject 1, which is your first principal idea, and then a composer might say, well, I'm quite happily motoring along in the tonic key. I think I'll have another subject, but it's still in the tonic key. So because it's still in the tonic key, it belongs to the first subject area. So you begin to see how this key focus is sort of quite an important part of the thing. Okay, so what happens next? Well, we might have some kind of transition. Again, it's optional. So let's put it in brackets. Anything in brackets is an option. And then you're going to have your second subject. Now, in classical period terms, the second subject will be in the dominant key. Okay, now it's quite possible if you have a sonata form movement in a minor key, the second subject might be in the relative major, but this tonic dominant relationship is pretty important. Just going back to the transition thing for a moment, I mean, who decides whether we have a transition or we don't? Well, it's perfectly possible to have your tonic key come to a cadence in the tonic key and then just launch straight into the second subject in the dominant key. There's quite often, not always the case, but quite often there's a rest, some kind of gap, some small period of musical silence between the first and the second subject. Then the second subject just begins in the dominant key. But you might decide that you don't really want to have that gap, but you want to have something that's a bit more continuous, or you want to make that transition from the tonic to the dominant key a bit smoother, so you might just write a few bars or something to connect. So that's why you might have a transition between the first subject and the second subject. Second subject, though, in classical period terms, is going to be in the dominant key. When we move on to the Romantic period, well, composers become more adventurous about that, and they say, why does it have to be in the dominant key? Why couldn't it be in some other key? So we'll see examples of that in due course. But of course, just as you could have a first subject group, there's nothing to say that you can't have a second subject group. So it's exactly the same. If you've got more than one theme in the key of the second subject area, well, then we're talking about having a second subject group. So hopefully that kind of makes that fairly clear. Now, quite often the exposition will end with a codetta. Now, I'm not putting it in brackets this time because it's more likely that you'll have a codetta. But again, you don't have to have one. You could just say, well, there's my second subject in the dominant key. There's a cadence, boom. I'm quite happy now to call it a draw there. But often you do have a codetta. What's the purpose of the codetta? Well, it's really to bring the exposition to a close. And sometimes it has a key function, because what normally happens at the end of the exposition is that you'll come to a double bar line with a repeat sign. So if you're going to repeat back to the beginning of the exposition, well, of course, you can see one potential problem. The second subject will be in the dominant key. So you finish in the dominant key, you go back to the beginning of the exposition, you need to be in the tonic key. Well, it might be that it works all right to finish on the tonic chord of the dominant key, because if you think about it, let's give an example. Say the first subject is in C major, so your dominant key is G major. You've finished in G major on the tonic chord, so that's a chord of G major. Well, of course, the tonic chord of G major is also the dominant chord of C major. So it's a pivot chord, which means you could go back to C major quite easily. But many composers just decide to write a little codetta that either takes us back to C major or just does this job of kind of wrapping up the exposition, if you like. So that's how we expect an exposition to work. Okay, so this is repeated, as we say. I mean, often in performances, people miss out those repeats, but to do the job fully, then the repeat should be there. It might have a first time and a second time bar, which would enable you to do this job of going back to the tonic key in the first time bar, but in the second time bar would enable you to move on somewhere else. So you might find first and second time bars being used in the codetta as well. But whatever happens there, we will then move on to the development section. Development, says he, making sure he's got a spelling that makes sense. So the development section, and that is really what it says on the tin. So we're taking ideas from the exposition and we're developing. So we might take the first subject, for example, and we might say, well, let's have the first subject in a different key. If my exposition started in C major for the first subject, the second subject was in G major, well, I might decide at the development section I'm going to go to A minor, the relative minor of the original tonic key. And from there, I might explore some other keys. So it may simply be a question of taking the first subject and repeating the first subject in a number of different keys. It may be that I can take some fragment of the first subject, the first bit of it, or an idea that forms part of the first subject and develop that. Maybe use some sequence or something. So the idea is that you're picking up on either the first subject in its entirety or components of the first subject and developing those. Of course, you do exactly the same with a second subject. And as the composer, you're very free to decide how much time you're allocating to developing the first subject, how much time you're allocating to developing the second subject. So the development section is a very free section, if you like. You might think, well, it's rather freer than the exposition. I mean, the exposition is freer than it looks. Do you want a first subject or a first subject group, a second subject or a second subject group? How long is the first subject area going to be? How long is the second subject area going to be? You can decide all these things. Have an introduction if you want or not. Have a coda if you want or not. But the development gives you a lot of freedom to say, okay, which are the ingredients that I'm going to take? How am I going to develop them? Which keys am I going to go through? You might think about reharmonization of the original ideas. You might think about exploring different textures. So if in the exposition your first and second subject themes were right-hand melodies accompanied by some Alberti bass or something in the left hand, you might think, well, actually in the development section I'm going to get some of this thematic material into the left hand if you're writing for piano, for example, and have some more figuration in the right hand. I mean, so it's not just kind of like, do I just take an idea from the subject or do I just present the subject in a different key? It's kind of, what can we do with these different ingredients? We might take a rhythmic characteristic and repeat that, use it in sequence, develop it in some way. We might take a melodic characteristic and play around with it by extending or contracting intervals. So it's recognizably part of the first subject or the second subject, but we're finding ways to develop it in some way. So whether you're developing it melodically or rhythmically or harmonically or devising some other way of using the texture, these are all possibilities for development, and they just give the composer a lot of freedom to work with it. Where it's satisfying for the listener, of course, and this is one reason why sonata form works so well, when you're wanting a slightly longer structure than you've previously had in these perhaps shorter binary form movements, is that the listener's heard the first subject at least once, has heard the second subject at least once. Then in the development, particularly taken that the exposition's been repeated, in the development, the listener quickly gets onto, oh, yes, I've heard that bit before. Even if it's at that sort of non-analytical level, something familiar comes along and the listener can get hold of it and say, oh, yeah, I've heard that idea. Oh, now it's sort of doing this and ducking and diving. But the composer is working in a rhythmic way or a melodic way or a harmonic way or in terms of texture. But to the listener, there's something familiar about it, which kind of gives the whole experience orally a kind of cohesion. You're not just being bombarded with new ideas and getting to the point of thinking, I can't cope with any more ideas. You are just re-experiencing ideas that have already been stated. And as the listener, perhaps you're getting quite intrigued by, oh, what's the composer going to do with this next? What other possibilities exist? So the development is a great creative space, and you can perhaps begin to see how that works. Okay, well, there comes a point where you've developed things as much as you want to, and you want to arrive at the recapitulation. So this is the final section, the recapitulation. Now, what do we expect to happen in the recapitulation? Notice I keep sort of offering this caveat of what we're expecting to happen, because sonata form is much freer than it looks, and you'll very quickly come across a sonata form movement and say, hang on a minute, I thought you told us the second subject had to be in the dominant key, but this one's got a second subject in the subdominant key. Well, that's going to happen. Absolutely. So when I say this is what should happen, this is the kind of standard framework that we're outlining at the moment, and we will come back and look at variations on this plan. So when we get to the recapitulation, well, how do we know we've arrived at the recapitulation? Well, what we're expecting to see and hear is a recapitulation of the first subject in the tonic key. Now, it might be presented exactly as it was back in the exposition. Might be an exact repeat of it. Might not be. Might be reorganized in some way. When you look through the first subject, you might think, oh, actually, some of that material has been reordered. There may even be some ongoing sense of development where you think, well, that's the first subject, but there's a kind of 4-bar extension there or something, as something's been, added to the original. Or maybe the texture is slightly different. This idea that the theme was in the right hand of the piano in the exposition, well, in the recapitulation, it's come in the left hand. There's nothing to say you can't do that. But you're expecting to recapitulate the first subject, or of course, the first subject group. And so if you had that before, well, it's likely to come up again in the recapitulation. If you had a transition in the exposition, well, you might have a transition again, or you might have had it in the exposition and then it might not happen in the recapitulation for reasons that are about to become obvious. Because, of course, the next thing you're going to do is recapitulate with the second subject or the second subject group, if you've used a second subject group. But here's the big difference. This time, the second subject is also going to be in the tonic key. Now, why? Because in the exposition, the second subject was in the dominant key. So if we're going to recapitulate, why mess about and change the second subject into the tonic key? Well, if you think about it, when we get to the end of the recapitulation, the movement will have finished. Do we want to finish a movement in the dominant key? No, we don't, do we? We want to finish it in the tonic key. This, by the way, throws up some difficulties sometimes for people learning pieces in sonata form, because you learn the second subject in the exposition in the dominant key, then it comes back in the recapitulation and you think, oh great, I know this bit, I've heard this before, and suddenly it feels different because of course it's in a different key. And when you're memorizing a movement in sonata form, there is a potential trap there, isn't there? You get to the second subject in the exposition, you move into the dominant key. When you come to the second subject in the recapitulation, you've got to make sure you're in the tonic key and your memory doesn't slip you into the dominant key simply because that's what you did in the exposition. And I've heard little disasters like that in the exam room over the years where people have got that little mistake in their memory. So anyway, but this is how the thing works. You have the second subject in the tonic key in the recapitulation so that we're now going to end our movement in the right key. Now, you may then think, well, I'm quite happy for the second subject to finish in the tonic key, and then I'll go home at that point or move on to the next movement. But you may well decide you're going to finish off with a coda. Now, we had a codetta at the end of the exposition maybe. So having a coda at the end of the recapitulation is a way of kind of matching that in the structure, but it's also a way of kind of rounding off, completing the entire movement. So if a coda is required to kind of bring things to a kind of resounding conclusion, well, that's its purpose really. You don't have to have a coda, but this time again, I've not put it in brackets for the same reason that I didn't put codetta in brackets at the end of the exposition, because it's maybe something that's more likely to happen than a first subject group, a second subject group, in terms of finishing off the thing. But you're already getting the idea, I hope, that while we've got certain fixed points, if you like, the three sections, exposition, development, recapitulation, that within that, we've got certain expectations, but we've also got quite a few options. And even then, actually, what is your first subject? That's up to every composer to create. What's the nature of it? Is it a long theme? Is it a short theme? Is it simple? Is it complex? What's going on? So you've got a huge amount of freedom. So in no way should sonata form be seen as some kind of musical straitjacket. And it has been criticised as that by some who say, well, why do I need to be boxed into this sonata form? You don't actually need to be boxed into anything. Nevertheless, one of our challenges when writing a longer movement is to have some kind of structure that works so that it does have an overall cohesion. And you see what's happening from the listener's perspective, just to kind of pick up on something I was talking about a little earlier. You've heard the first subject or the first subject group. You've heard the second subject and the second subject group, and that's given us contrast in thematic design, contrast in key. We've then repeated the exposition, so the listeners had a chance to revisit all of that, begin to kind of form a short-term memory at least of that. In the development section, the listener is hearing whole chunks of music or fragments of the exposition material being developed, so therefore it's kind of recognized. And it's also intriguing because the listener's wondering, well, what's going to happen to it now? Oh, it's in the other hand. Or I'm just hearing this fragment of it. Or now I've got a complete statement of that first subject, but seems to be in a different key, or a different octave or something. Or maybe the rhythm is being altered in some way, augmentation, diminution. I mean, all these things you can do. And then when you come to the recapitulation, it's almost like you're being taken back home, isn't it? It's like, okay, I've heard this first subject thing being developed in various ways. Now it's being put back as it was. It may not be identical, but it's going to be closer to the original. And then the listener has that sort of sense of comfort of, yes, I know this, I've heard this before. So it kind of comes back. And then same with the second subject group, but this time second subject or second subject group, but this time it's in the tonic key because that's where we want to be by the end of the movement. So you don't have a second subject in a different key and then suddenly you've got this coda that shocks us back to the tonic key. May not be entirely satisfactory. And you can begin to see that while this is a kind of structural explanation of sonata form, there's a lot of freedom within it, so composers did their own thing with it. And also it is based on this key relationship thing that I was referring to in the last video between the tonic and the dominant key. Those are not exclusive key areas, as I hope I've made clear, because in the development section you might wander off and explore all sorts of different keys, but there's still a fundamental sense of tonic and dominant, and that relationship that sort of takes us back to the origins in binary form. Now, the exposition is repeated. You might then be saying, well, what about the development and the recapitulation? Is all of that repeated? Sometimes you will find that that is the case. So sometimes you'll see repeat signs here, but actually, again, more often than not, you won't see those that section repeated. So the exposition is, the development and the recapitulation tends not to be. Why is that? Well, you've got a 3-section work: exposition, development, recapitulation. And I think composers were happier to move to 3 sections rather than have 2 sections, each of which is repeated, which sort of puts us back in the kind of rounded binary form kind of previous territory. Also, maybe it's overkill, because how many times are you then going to hear the first and the second subject if it's repeated in the exposition and then the development and the recapitulation is repeated? And if you're going to repeat the same development, you might say, well, maybe if I was going to repeat that, I might want to change it and develop in some other kind of way. So then it starts to generate a much bigger canvas for sonata form that maybe comes with its own problems. But what I've fundamentally tried to lay out in this video is the standard expectation of a sonata form movement.